Welcome to the webinar on Cultural Responsive PBIS. This webinar has been put together by the PBIS Division Coaching Team in collaboration with the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I want to start by introducing our presenters. I'd like to start with myself. My name is Karen DiMaggio. I'm the Coordinator of Psychological Services, and one of my great responsibilities is overseeing implementation and sustainment of PBIS across the division. With me today, I also have other presenters. I have Dr. Lakeisha Parrott, who is the Director of the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I have Rose Coates, who is one of our PBIS division coaches. I have Dayla Brown, who is our PBIS specialist. And then finally, I have Evan Moss, who is another of our PBIS division coaches. Let's click for me, please, Dayla. All right, we are happy to have you as members of your PBIS school teams. Our learning objectives today, we have a couple of them for you. First, we're going to look at the definition as far as understanding cultural responsiveness within the PBIS framework. Then we're also going to look at some key components. We're going to learn the 5 components of culturally responsive Tier I PBIS implementation. We are also going to look at alignment and reflect on the specific ways Tier I implementation can align to the 5 components of culturally responsive PBIS. And then finally, we're going to look at some next steps, plan for some future PBIS teamwork to support culturally responsive implementation. One of the big things as far as doing this work is really identifying this why. I'm just going to give you a couple seconds to read the quote on the screen. And to really look and think and reflect on why this presentation. Culturally responsive practices is work that belongs to all of us. It informs of how all of our work supports students as well as staff. This topic has become more relevant because of current events, but we really want to emphasize it has always been relevant to our work related to social, emotional, and behavioral support, and also the decisions focused on equity. This did not just become important right now, but it has become critical as we have started and continued the implementation and sustainment of PBIS across the division. This work is driven by our desire for diverse, equitable, and inclusive environments. We also have to recognize that it comes from some of our PBIS data. In reviewing of our PBIS data across the division from 2020, it became clear when we looked at TFI feature 1.11, which has to do with the student, family, community involvement, it revealed some opportunities where we need some greater growth across all levels, which means elementary, middle school, and high school. Understanding that this area is critical foundation for cultural responsiveness, it presents the need to dive deeper and uncover the practical ways we can view PBIS implementation through a culturally responsive lens. Whenever we start our work with schools, staff, school teams, we always want to anchor it in our strategic framework. Our division acknowledges that student well-being and social-emotional learning is a priority, even more so in our current environment. It has to do with developing equitable and supportive learning environments, and PBIS specifically speaks to Goal 2 as it is defined as and here's our definition that we often start with, a data-informed decision-making framework for establishing the social, cultural, and behavioral academic supports needed for a school to be effective learning environment for all, and I always like to emphasize the all, for all students. Every goal within the strategic framework has an embedded equity emphasis. Within Goal 2, we are focused on engaging in culturally responsive practices division-wide. We identify and address inequities and discipline practices by investigating and implementing best practices and seeking innovative solutions. Through PBIS, VBCPS has had the desire to move toward equitable discipline and foster positive school climate.
The question has been asked, where does equity live in our work? The focus on equity is not something new. This work lives within our strategic goals, our teaching and learning framework, the graduate profile, and is essential to our division's core values. For example, one of the division's core values is to value differences. The work of equity lives within this core value as we work to support all students and staff through our division-wide implementation of PBIS. Together, we engage in this work to ensure equitable outcomes for every student. The Virginia Department of Education has shared the following graphic when explaining the difference between equality and equity. On the left, the different plants are surviving while the system provides equal inputs. While on the right, the system differentiates inputs for the different plants. As you may notice, they are both thriving. We want you to take a moment as a PBIS team and reflect on this question. How does this graphic represent the diverse needs and supports your students and staff may have in your building? Dayla, may we go back, please? I have one more point to make. Again, looking at this graphic, this work isn't about a separate process. It's not an add-on. PBIS implementation, it's about being intentional and integrative on how we implement PBIS in a culturally responsive manner. We must continue to examine the supports and inputs our systems provide to meet the social, emotional, and behavioral needs of all students and staff. The information that has been shared and will be shared is based on guidance provided in the PBIS Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide. We want to acknowledge that this is ongoing learning and is essential as we continue to meet equity, which is a central focus of our work in the division. We must constantly revisit our efforts to sustain culturally responsive implementation. The Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide will be added to every school's shared PBIS drive and will be made available on the Cultural Responsive Practices stockpile. On your screen, you see 3 principles that guide our work for culturally responsive PBIS. A, high expectations for all students. B, using students' cultures and experiences to enhance their learning. And finally, providing all students with access to effective instruction and adequate resources for learning. So as you consider the 3 principles, reflect on the following. How has your school community prioritized these 3 principles? And were those 3 goals achieved during your K-12 educational experiences, both as a learner and now as an educator?
The 5 components of culturally responsive PBIS are identity, voice, supportive environment, situational appropriateness, and data for equity. Throughout our time together in this webinar, we will illustrate how several of the 15 Tier I features from the TFI of PBIS implementation are addressed within these 5 components. The first component we will discuss is identity. To increase cultural responsiveness in our systems, school personnel need to be aware of and understand their personal cultures and values, including how these traits impact their classroom and school environments. Students and families can be engaged or disengaged when personal cultures and values are projected onto these environments. The engagement of students and families in the school community can be increased when school staff seek to understand not only their own cultural identities, but also understand and validate the values of the community they serve. When we refer to identity, we must understand that this is complex and involves different levels of culture. Please take a moment to pause and reflect on the iceberg graphic with your school team. A quote was shared at the recent Ed Equity Conference. We commit to self-awareness through critical self-assessment. Taking a closer look at identity also prompts us to grow our own self-awareness and social awareness as we examine cultural and racial identity, implicit bias, and historical context. Engaging in this reflection enables us to approach our work with an anti-racist lens. Within the slide notes are some activities, videos, and articles that can be used to engage with staff around personal identity, implicit bias, and historical context. Also, remember to sign up for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion newsletter, which anchors equity and shares important relevant resources. Engaging in reflection around identity, bias, and historical context involves several considerations as staff engage and learn together. It requires us to create safe, brave spaces where these conversations and reflections can take place. These considerations include a culture of shared norms or agreements about how the group will work together. These norms will help us answer questions like, how will we treat one another? What will we do if we disagree? And how we engage in challenging content. You will find a link to an article from ASCD on the power of team norms that can assist teams with creating these shared agreements. The use of discussion and reflection protocols. You'll find several examples of these activities in the culturally responsive practices and social emotional learning stockpiles. Both of these resources have been linked on the slide. Participation in courageous conversations requires introspection and honesty about our own beliefs. We must acknowledge discomfort. We should have a written process available for staff, students, and families to request assistance. We must remember that this is a gradual process and will not happen overnight. It's important that we keep these conversations going and at the forefront. All of these considerations connect to the core values of Virginia Beach City Public Schools and the 2025 Strategic Framework. Feature 1.7 of the TFI, Professional Learning, aligns with the first component, identity, as we consider formal processes for providing training and practice to staff in this area. As we provide professional learning opportunities for staff related to PBIS implementation, how can we create spaces where identity, bias, and historical context may be explored? PBIS.org offers this activity to explore our personal beliefs as we consider how they might compare to our school setting and the beliefs that our students and families may have. As a PBIS team, you can take this time to discuss what your responses might be to the following prompt in the red box within the grid. What were your values growing up related to appropriate responses to insults? What are your values now? What does our school value? How might students' and families' beliefs be different, and how might this difference create potential conflict? The next component that we will be discussing is voice. Authentic family and community engagement includes providing stakeholders with meaningful opportunities to be heard, voice their opinions, and exercise leadership within the school system. School teams should make it a priority to engage with families, students, and community members that are representative of the school's demographics and includes any underserved populations. Students and families have opportunities to see themselves, their cultural values, and their histories in the school setting. You may want to take time to reflect and consider as a team. Was this last sentence your experience in your elementary school? Consider also, how do you imagine your students and families might respond to that question? In the picture, you will see an example of a family engagement activity done in North Cumberland. During this activity, students and parents engaged in creating positive praise statements to be posted around their school building. This activity is also linked in the slide. Another example of authentic family engagement would be Roosevelt Family Night. The team planned an amazing Ray-style event, created check-in with Green Run High School student volunteers acting as guides throughout the night. Each family participated in a morning meeting, then traveled to different classrooms, participating in yoga poses, matrix puzzles, and learning the Rosemont Pledge. Families completed the race in the cafeteria for pizza and cookie delivered by high school volunteers. Admin led a conversation about PBIS, and parents completed an at-home matrix with students. Hosting a virtual community open house would be a way to provide opportunities for feedback and information about expectations, acknowledgement, ways to get involved, and options to hear about resources in the local community. How can we provide meaningful engagement opportunities? We have some suggestions that include using meeting software to discuss relevant topics, data, and feedback to inform our next steps. Utilizing a formal schedule and space to obtain ongoing feedback and encourage decision-making with students. Offering an open house or student breakout session that includes invitations for students to participate. And distributing surveys and feedback tools that have been developed or reviewed by families and students. As a team, consider your response to this question. Can you envision a creative way a representative group of family members can be integrated into our work as a PBIS team? We have provided additional resources in the slide notes that will assist in ensuring student voice during remote learning. The core component voice is embedded into 3 TFI features: 1.1 team composition, 1.10 faculty involvement, and 1.11 student, family, and community involvement. You will see these features on the slide as well as a description of each. As we plan in these TFI areas, discuss with your team. How can we ensure meaningful opportunities in these areas?
The third component we're going to discuss today is a supportive environment. In a supportive environment, staff work to meet student needs and teach students the necessary or missing skills rather than assume that the students already know them. Staff understand that school expectations exist as a framework to teach rather than a system through which infractions are delivered. They also understand that the acknowledgement system is intended to encourage the learning and generalization of those desired behaviors. And when inappropriate behavior is observed, staff recognize the need to understand a student's personal context, as well as the need to review those expectations and reinforce social emotional skills. Most importantly, students in a supportive environment feel valued. As you consider this description, which phrase for you stands out? Let's take a look closer at the specific TFI features that this component relates to. 1.6, discipline policies. 1.9, feedback and acknowledgement. And 1.8, classroom procedures. We're going to take a step further and look at the last feature, specifically talking about our classroom procedures. The Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide references a set of strategies referred to as the VABB approach: validation, affirmation, building, and bridging, as a set of strategies that can be used by staff to facilitate the shift that students may experience as they move between the home and school environment, which is also known as code switching. Through our Tier I PBIS professional learning, we've shared the 8 classroom practices with you, and they're also linked here for you with our one-pagers here. And we really want to make sure that it's important to consider how our identity informs these classroom practices. So if you've started the conversation or reflection among your staff around identity or implicit bias, think about how you can come back to this conversation and reflect on how our cultural identity and implicit bias influences the development of these classroom practices. As a team, reflect together on this question. How can our behavior feedback, both acknowledgement and correction, offer opportunity for validation, affirmation, building, and/or bridging? When considering validation, you want to be legitimizing the aspects of students' cultures that may have historically been seen as illegitimate by the dominant culture. For affirmation, we want to be explicitly acknowledging the worth of students' cultures and learning histories. Considering building by providing specific instruction regarding why certain student behaviors are necessary in certain school settings. And bridging, those opportunities to practice what those shared expectations are, acknowledging students and providing encouraging, skill-based, non-judgmental correction when needed. The fourth component that we're going to discuss today is situational appropriateness. Situational appropriateness is the ability to determine what types of behavior will ensure positive outcomes in a given setting and includes altering one's behaviors when settings, contexts, or companions change. Staff who seek to validate and affirm students will refrain from making assumptions about student behavior and will instead seek to understand it. This will require conscious attention to the dynamics of cultural differences between the staff, students, and environment. Staff will have an understanding of their own values and how those values might influence their expectations and interpretations of student behavior. Teams should develop and revise expectations that are reflective of the cultural values of the surrounding community and are based on the legitimate purpose within the setting. Again, let's take a closer look at the specific TFI features that this component relates to. 1.3, behavioral expectations. 1.4, teaching of those expectations. And 1.5, problem behavior definitions. We're going to take a step further and dive into the first feature or the first component, 1.3, behavioral expectations. PBIS.org shares a webinar which engages the PBIS teams in what's called a personal matrix activity. So students and families complete the last two columns that you see here on the screen, which are then compared to the first column, the school expectations that are developed by the school. Once the activity is completed, the presenter or group lead shares what we should be asking ourselves. What are the differences? Are the different school rules necessary for positive student development? And what additional practice, teaching, or acknowledgement may be needed to support these behaviors in the school environment? Recognizing our students' unique cultures is vital to the social emotional learning and developing a supportive environment. Think about the values and beliefs that you bring into the learning environment and how they are communicated through the decisions you make as you interact with students. Administrators have been sharing that they're reflecting on the expectations that they have been established through a social justice lens. In other words, are these expectations equitable for all students? Here are several questions to consider when reviewing your school-wide matrix. Are our expectations inclusive for all students? Are we considering safety, which means do our expectations reinforce emotional safety for our students? Are these expectations that are there expectations that are conflicting? Who benefits from these expectations? Are the expectations necessary for student success? And what is the purpose of this expectation, or what is the goal? We encourage you as teams to review the last draft of your school-wide matrix with these questions in mind. So share possible thoughts that might need to be revised or moving the work forward.
As we consider the last component of culturally responsive PBIS implementation, we want to examine data for equity. Culturally responsive systems are based on an understanding that it is imperative to disaggregate data for analysis and action planning, and openly discuss trends in the data regarding equity. When we talk about disaggregation, we're talking about looking at the who, what, where, when, and why of our data. Disaggregation requires that teams engage in active database decision-making with that specific focus on equity. During this process, it's critical to first address issues of disparate impact at the systems level, rather than looking to place blame on the students or families. Thinking beliefs such as those kids are disrespectful or those families don't value education. We also need to consider how we view and process our disaggregated data. If disaggregated groups, or commonly referred to as subgroups, aren't reflecting expected rates of success at a Tier 1 level, then we aren't meeting the needs of all students. This is a good opportunity to share as a team. What one word comes to mind when you reflect on your experience with this process of data-informed decision-making? Let's take a closer look at the specific TFI features which relate to data for equity. 1.12, discipline data, what data we have access to. 113, that process of database decision-making. 114, fidelity data, how we assess fidelity of implementation. And then annual evaluation. How do we share our report on fidelity with our important stakeholder groups? And so now let's take a step further and look specifically at 1.13, that problem-solving process that PBIS teams engage in. As we take steps to prepare for a virtual return to school in the fall, the role of the PBIS team will be critical as we continue to function as that decision-making team that responds to each school's unique needs, both for staff and students. Through PBIS, we focus on improving our data, practices, and systems in order to meet our goals. What data will we need to review to assess our systems and practices? What goals do we have for behavioral and social-emotional support? And then how will those goals inform the systems we develop to support staff and the practices staff utilize to support students and families? We have provided a link to this problem-solving worksheet in the one-pager resource document as well. Before meeting as a team, consider these guiding questions when planning for your PBIS team meeting. Which school goal will the PBIS team work to support this year? Have we identified what forms of data we will use throughout the year? A recently published CASEL guide suggests that upon school reopening, we may review data such as student, family, and staff interviews or surveys, the responses we gather, as well as data on those who haven't responded, outreach to families who has or hasn't been successfully contacted by school staff or who hasn't accessed those available supports, and then of course, student attendance, participation, and completion with at-home learning. Also, where's the data? Identifying who's bringing it to the meeting. And then of course, is data at the forefront of our agenda? And with those second and third points, we also want to consider the role of the data analyst and how they function to initiate and organize that process. Here are some guiding questions to consider during the meeting process. We will want to consider how we will identify the who, what, where, when, and why of behavior in our school. And then when engaging in a review of data, if inequity is evident, here are some guiding questions. Are there gaps in the fidelity of PBIS implementation at our school? Are students and families adequately involved in all stages of PBIS implementation? In looking at groups of students, what trends might we notice? Is there a need also for professional learning related to cultural identity, implicit bias, or historical context? This bullet here specifically speaks to that part of social emotional learning for adults as well. And then, of course, do we need to support staff with culturally responsive practices? Here are some considerations after PBIS meetings which increase buy-in, relevance, and stakeholder involvement. How and when can we share data or progress with staff, students, and families? How can we involve students and families during PBIS Fidelity learning walks? Together, take time as a team to share a key takeaway that can help us engage in more effective decision-making as a PBIS team. As we reflect on the information that's been shared throughout this presentation, we want to leave you with this quote from the PBIS Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide. We understand that building responsive environments requires an understanding of how our school systems have been established, how well they support students from varying cultures, and how they can be changed to ensure the support and validation of each student. Again, we want to share this is an ongoing conversation that involves ongoing work. This work is not only critical to the PBIS coaching team, but it's integral to the work of the PBIS division implementation team as we work toward equity across the division. As we engage in equity work, we need to remain vigilant that we avoid racial equity detours. This quote and several of these key points about racial equity detours and key principles are shared in an Educational Leadership Magazine article by Paul Gorski within the resource document we provided to you. This article can provide helpful points of reflection and action as you work toward the goal of equity. In thinking about what has been discussed in this presentation, we'll encourage your team to reflect together here. What might be something that squares with your thinking that you heard throughout this presentation? What might be a point you feel is critical as we consider future planning? What might be something that's still circling around in your head? And then, what might be a new direction you might go in or an action you might plan to take? We want to share as well as we did in our summer leadership series, some of the adjustments we've made to our division expectations regarding PBIS Fidelity. All TFI Fidelity goals set for 2020 and beyond are moved forward 1 year. This means, for example, if you had a goal for reaching 80% Fidelity of Tier I by spring of 2020, that goal would be moved forward to spring of 2021. We will continue as we move forward this year to revisit those goals as well, and we'll communicate with you throughout the year. Advanced Tiers training previously scheduled for August 2020 for Cohort 4 schools will be offered tentatively August of 2021. In addition, Cohort 5 elementary schools will have the option to join. We also want to invite you to reach out to us as well. Please share calendar invites with us as we support you through your virtual monthly PBIS team meetings. We are also available to assist with staff professional learning as we have in the past, so please be sure to contact us for virtual support. And then, of course, please reach out for additional information and support and any resources we might be able to share with you as we move forward this school year. As we close this webinar session, we leave you with this quote from Brené Brown. As we recognize the importance of human connection during this time, both among staff and with our students. We're grateful to share with you today, and we look forward to connecting with you in the upcoming weeks and throughout the school year.